Welcome to Fortune Forecast. I am Daisy, your hostess, and you are in my book playlist, where we started the book titled The Psychic Life of Jesus. This book was written by Rev G. Maurice Elliott and published by the Spiritualist Press in 1938. Reverend Elliott here, through this book, is bringing us into an awareness of how powerful it was when Jesus said to us that you will do greater things than I have. The master healer was teaching us the process, was showing us the way, and not taking credit for any of it, and saying, "As is thy faith, so be it unto you." Clearly, that is a very big truth. In addition, we are also taught by Jesus that everything depended on conditions. What conditions could that be? It's that mental mindset. If in that environment there are naysayers and doubters, then the conditions are not favorable for a positive outcome. I believe the bottom line, what I'm learning here, is that Jesus came to show us how powerful the mind is. And in a sense, setting man free from himself. And because I have more questions than answers at this moment, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the next chapter. 14. The feeding of the 5,000 made the people feel that Jesus was their long-expected Messiah who, like Moses, had fed them in the wilderness, and they wanted to take him by force and make him king. Jesus, fearing lest his disciples might be carried away by this dangerous enthusiasm of the crowd, told them to return at once to Capernaum. He then dismissed the people and withdrew by himself to a mountain to pray. When evening was come, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started for Capernaum. It was dark, and the wind was against them. After rowing for 2 or 3 hours, they saw Jesus walking, as it seemed, on the sea, and cried out in fear. But he called to them, "Do not be frightened, it is I." Peter was so elated by these words that he got out of the boat and walked on the water towards him. But his faith was too weak to maintain this state of psychic exaltation, and he soon began to sink. Jesus at once stretched his hand out and caught him, saying, "How little faith you have! Why did you doubt?" And when they were come into the boat, the wind ceased, and immediately the boat was at the land whither they were going. Did Jesus and Peter really walk on water? Did the boat instantly reach Capernaum? The modernist who has rightly given up belief in miracles says no. The story is an exaggeration similar to others which came into vogue when the church was beginning to deify Jesus. Well, that sounds quite feasible, much more feasible than to regard the incident as miraculous. The spiritualist, however, is so familiar with the scientific facts of levitation and transportation that the story interests him very much. He would not say that the incident actually occurred, but that there is no reason why it should not have occurred. The phenomena of levitation and transportation have been known from ancient days. Some 200 saints of the church have experienced levitation. A friend of mine, who has been excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church on account of her belief in spiritualism, tells me that at the last service she attended, she was levitated from the altar steps right down the main aisle of the church. St. Francis and St. Teresa experienced levitation. St. Joseph of Cupertino was levitated 15 times. The people and the members of his order and Pope Urban VIII witnessed his levitation. Catherine Emmerich The stigmatic visionary was frequently lifted up suddenly into the air. Dr. W. F. Geikie Cobb, in his book Spiritual Healing, quotes Brother Ramananda, who says, "I have walked on water and glided through great ravines in the Himalayas. Near our summer residence, which was a forest, there was a stretch of water where each season storks used to come to breed, and they would always ask me to come at the time of hatching. I remember, though only 4 or 5 years of age, gliding on the water to their nest, over which they were standing in the water, as it's their custom." The monk Maurice and St. Peter of Alcantara are said to have walked on water. Lady Maud Warrender, in her book My First 60 Years, tells of a man in India who was not a yogi, though he had studied yoga, who was seen to walk on water. He asked us if we would like to come into his garden, and presently the officer called out, "Mr. Jacob is going to walk on water," whereupon he did step, not into, but on the water, and deliberately walked across the pond. The water being very clear, we could see the astonished fish darting in all directions under his feet. After returning from the other side, he stepped ashore. I asked for his shoes to see if they were wet. The soles were only just damp, as if he had walked over a wet pavement. Jacob said, "That is nothing. Anyone can float in air and walk on water, but now I will show you something that really requires power. Shut your eyes and imagine that you are in your bungalow." I did so. "Now open your eyes." I opened them to find that in 2 seconds I was in my bungalow, 3/4 of a mile away. I then walked into the dining room where 2 of my guests were sitting. They started, "How the deuce did you get here?" So I sat down and told them all that had happened in Jacob's house. This amazing experience is one worth recording. In 2 seconds, I was in my bungalow. Compared with that, immediately the boat was at the land. The modern experience is somewhat analogous to the New Testament experience, is it not? Thomas Blyton, who was president of a spiritualist church, told me that when he was at a séance at Hackney, his friend Frank Hearn was transported into their midst. A few moments before, Hearn and some friends had been witnessing a theatrical play in the West End of London. His friends suddenly missed him. Spirit operators had dematerialized his body and rematerialized it in the séance room at Hackney. Apollonius of Tyana was dematerialized in the presence of the Emperor Domitian and rematerialized at Puteoli some miles away. The New Testament tells of Philip, who was caught away not by the Spirit of the Lord, as it is said, but by a Spirit of the Lord, and found himself at Azotus some 30 miles away. Mrs. Guppy, the wife of a rich man, had transported in a moment from Higbury to Lamb's Conduit Street, 3 miles away. Dr. Joseph Laponi, medical officer of Pope Leo XIII and Pius X, records the case of the Pansini boys who were constantly transported. Dr. Franz Hartmann records the case of a friend of his who was transported 50 miles in 15 minutes. Carlo Mirabelli was transported over 40 miles in less than 2 minutes. Sir William Crookes assures us that there were at least 100 instances of D&D Homes levitations. I remember seeing a page advertisement giving about a dozen illustrations from the book An Outline of Science. One was of D.D. Home floating in the air over Victoria Street, London. I mention this to show that the authors of this book of science regarded levitation as a scientific fact and did not hesitate to insert in their book an illustration of it. This phenomenon of floating in the air was vouched for by the Master of Lindsay, Lord Adair, afterwards Earl of Dunraven, and Captain C. Wine, who gave Sir William Crookes the most minute account of what they had seen. Holmes was with these 3 men in a room, and was lifted from his chair by invisible agency and carried in a horizontal position through an aperture of 18 inches in the window. He was then seen by them outside the window, floating in space 85 feet above the ground of Victoria Street. He then floated back, feet foremost, through another window. Crookes writes, "To reject the recorded evidence on this subject is to reject all human testimony, for no fact in sacred or profane history is supported by a stronger array of proofs." This brings us to the crux of the whole matter. The so-called miracles of the New Testament have their counterpart in the psychic phenomena of today, and that is just what Jesus led us to expect. His followers were to do the works that he did, and greater. But if any man rejects, as unproven, the facts of psychic science, he must also reject, as unproven, the so-called miracles of Jesus. If man of our day have not seen the phenomena of levitation, transportation, dematerialization, and materialization, if they have been the victims of hallucination, fake and fraud, then we have no reason whatever for thinking that Peter and the other disciples were not the victims of hallucination, fake, and fraud. It does not in any way belittle Jesus to say that what he predicted is coming to pass. And though it be true that no medium today has proven comparable to those of Jesus, the reason for this is not far to seek. The Church has been so successful in excommunicating, persecuting, and even burning those possessed of the gifts of the Spirit that it is a marvel that there are any left. Yet, though surrounded by the nullifying vibrations of unbelief, our mediums are still able to do, in a modified form, the works that Jesus did. And it is the signs and wonders being done by or through mediums that make it possible for intelligent persons today not to disbelieve in the signs and wonders done by or through Jesus. End of chapter. Stay right here. We will move on now to chapter 15. Why was Jesus transfigured? Why did Moses and Elijah materialize? Why were only 3 apostles allowed to witness the transfiguration? Such a stupendous display of psychic power was of supreme significance, and one would have thought it essential that all the apostles should witness it. No sufficient answer to the above questions can be given except by those who are familiar with the psychic happenings of today. The narrative has a background which is extremely important, and the more one knows of the background, the more one is able to grasp the significance of the transfiguration. It begins with the words, "About 8 days after these sayings." What sayings? Jesus had been saying to his disciples that he must suffer many things, be rejected, be killed, and the 3rd day be raised up. How did he know? He must either have seen it all clairvoyantly or heard it clairaudiently. His disciples were nonplussed. They understood not. They could not believe that their Messiah would be killed and his cause ruined. Peter, who a moment before had called Jesus Messiah, now dared to rebuke him with, "God must forbid it. This shall never be unto thee." He had hoped that Jesus would be a conquering king who would slaughter the hated Romans. Jesus replied, "Get behind me, you Satan. You are a hindrance to me. You care not for the things of God, but the things of men. As to their Messiah being raised up on the third day, it conveyed little or nothing to these ignorant and dull-witted disciples. They had, of course, no real knowledge of the survival of personality immediately after the death of the body. Jesus had to prepare the minds of the disciples for his death and resurrection. It was no use talking to them, the less they seemed to understand. So he determined on a plan of action whereby Moses and Elijah, in materialized form, should speak to him in the hearing of Peter, James, and John about his coming crucifixion. This would be sure to convince them because Moses and Elijah represented the law and the prophets. Meanwhile, Jesus would dematerialize his body and show himself in all the glory of his spiritual body. This would convince them that the death of his physical body would not mean the death of him. Moreover, it would acquaint them with the appearance of his spirit body and thus prepare them to recognize him when he showed himself to them after his crucifixion. Now to the narrative in detail, a psychic narrative from beginning to end. When it was dark, Jesus took Peter, James, and John to a high mountain, Hermon, 10,000 feet, apart by themselves. The rarefied mountain air, the stillness and the darkness would contribute greatly to the success of the sacred séance. On reaching some lonely spur of the mountain, Jesus began to pray. And, as he prayed, his friends saw his appearance change, and his raiment turn to dazzling white. Jesus had dematerialized and now stood before them in spirit form, clothed in shining raiment exceeding white as snow. This whiteness is something well understood by students of psychic phenomenon. The disciples then saw Moses and Elijah in glory. That does not mean in heaven. It means in spirit bodies arrayed in the brightness of their spirit robes. When Paul speaks of the body of our humiliation being fashioned anew into the likeness of his glorious body, he is referring to our physical body and to the spirit body of Jesus. Paul had seen Jesus in his glorified body and spoke of what he knew. Unfortunately, the details of the conversation which took place between Jesus and his two spirit friends are not given us. But we are told that Peter, James, and John heard Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus about his coming death. The Greek word means departure or passing on, and urging him to go through with it. Vide Moffat's translation. Moses and Elijah thus corroborated what Jesus had been telling his disciples and which they could not believe. And what an inspiration it must have been to Jesus to speak with his two friends about his coming cross. My own view is that when, by means of his psychic faculty, he saw himself nailed to a cross, he longed to speak with those on the other side about it. He was human, and the transfiguration would have had as deep a significance for Jesus as for the disciples. He needed the strength and encouragement which Moses and Elijah could give to enable him to go through with it. But, being anxious that his disciples should hear what Moses and Elijah had to say, it was necessary that these men of old time should materialize. This would mean that certain physical laws would have to be fulfilled. There is no such thing as a miracle. And if discarnate persons are to be seen and heard by incarnate persons, the presence of a medium or medium is essential. There were 4 mediums present. Jesus, superlatively the greatest, had dematerialized, and no doubt the elements of his discarded body had provided part of the means for the materializations of Moses and Elijah. Peter, James, and John were in deep trance, weighed down with sleep, and psychic power would have been drawn from them. On waking up or coming out of trance, the 3 mediums would gradually regain full consciousness, and they would see and hear Moses and Elijah in a very real sense, though they might be somewhat bewildered as men are when coming to after an anesthetic. And that is exactly what happened. The narrative tells us that when they were awake, they saw and heard Moses, Elijah, and Jesus talking together. The psychic power was still holding, but gradually going, and Moses and Elijah were departing, i.e., dematerializing. Thus we read, and as Moses and Elijah were departing, Peter hurriedly suggested in his half-dazed condition, not knowing what he said, that he should make 3 huts or booths, simple structures made of branches of trees, common in Palestine, to protect them against the cold. It would have been doubly cold at that time on the mountain. It was night. And the process of materialization is always accompanied by low temperature, as those who leave their overcoats outside their seance room know only too well. Peter was so thrilled by what he had seen that he wanted the multitude to share his experience. He was therefore prepared to do anything that might make it possible for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus to remain as he had seen them until he had had time to fetch the multitude. But even as Peter was making his suggestion, there came a cloud and overshadowed them, and they feared as they passed into it. Why did they fear? A mist on the mountain does not cause men to fear. It cannot have been an ordinary mist or cloud. Students of psychic science know what it was. It was the usual ectoplasmic cloud which screens the process of materialization and dematerialization, and the disciples were unfamiliar with it. Moses and Elijah were dematerializing. Jesus was rematerializing, and out of the cloud there came a voice. "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." The disciples were afraid and fell on their faces, and when the voice was past, they looked up and saw no man, save Jesus only. The 2 great mediums of the Old Testament, the lawgiver and the prophet, had returned to the spheres of eternal life, and Jesus had returned to our world. Jesus then charged the disciples that they should tell no man what things they had seen till he was risen from the dead, but they did not understand what the rising from the dead should mean. And even on the day of his resurrection, they knew not that he must rise from the dead. Has such dullness of mind ever been surpassed? End of chapter. Stay right here, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel as we go on to chapter 16. When Jesus and his 3 disciples were back on the plain, they found the 9 other disciples surrounded by a crowd and some scribes arguing with them. Jesus asked what the discussion was about. And a man from the crowd came to him and said that he had brought his lunatic son to him to be healed. But finding that he had gone up the mount, he had asked his disciples to exorcise the unclean spirit that was possessing the lad, and they could not. These 9 disciples had not obeyed the instructions given them by Jesus. They ought to have been able to carry on his work, but in his absence, they had lost faith. Jesus said to them, "What faithless men you are! Must I always be present with you to stimulate your faith? How much longer am I to be patient with you? Bring the lad to me." So they brought him. But when the spirit saw Jesus, it at once convulsed the lad, and he fell on the ground and rolled about foaming at the mouth. Note carefully what followed. Jesus, the great psychological healer, asked the father, "How long has this spirit possessed him? How frequent are the seizures? Do they take the form of suicidal frenzy?" The father told him that the spirit had possessed his son from childhood, that the seizures were frequent, and that the spirit often threw the lad into fire and water to destroy him. From this, Jesus knew that the spirit had a firm hold on the lad, and that much psychic power would be needed to exorcise it. Unfortunately, the father's faith had suffered a rude shock from the powerlessness of the disciples of the great healer, and all he could say to Jesus was, "If you can do anything, do help us, do have pity on us." "If I can," said Jesus, "anything can be done for one who has faith." Jesus knew that the possibility of healing the lad depended largely upon the father's faith. So he deliberately threw the man back upon himself, making him feel that the healing of his son depended on his own belief. "I do believe. Help my unbelief," cried the man. That was enough. Jesus knew that those who best believe best know the unbelief that lurks in their hearts. And he at once rebuked the unclean spirit. "Deaf and dumb spirit, leave this lad, I command you, and never enter him again." And it did so. It is instructive to notice that the event following immediately upon the transfiguration was the healing of this poor lad. From the glorious and almost overpowering experience of psychic phenomena on the Mount to the ordinary, everyday work of healing. Rather beautiful, isn't it? And what a lesson for the disciples and for all disciples. Biblical commentators tell us that Jesus accepted the faith of the Father for the faith which the lad was not in a position to offer. What exactly do they mean by accepted the faith of the Father? Do they mean that the man's expression of trust in Jesus so pleased the great healer that he consented to heal the lad? Surely they cannot mean that. I do not like that word accepted. Had they said that Jesus used the psychic power which the man's faith had released, stimulated, or produced, I could have understood their meaning. But accepted is a term far too theological to be used in this connection. Why was it that Jesus could do no mighty works where there was unbelief? It was not because he refused to do them unless men acknowledged his divine status. It was because unbelief creates a nullifying psychic barrier. It is no passive condition. It is a positive, active influence. And in the case we are dealing with, it was essential that the nullifying unbelief of the Father expressed in the words, "if you can," should be removed. But something more was needed too. Genuine belief has the effect of releasing inherent psychic power. And as the lad's malady was deep-rooted, for the unclean spirit had possessed him from childhood, Jesus needed the additional power which a believing father could give in order to exorcise the spirit. I can attach no meaning to the idea that the faith of the lad's father was accepted in place of the lad's faith. Well, the 9 disciples who, because of their little faith, had been unable to release from within themselves sufficient psychic power to exorcise the unclean spirit, asked Jesus the reason. He told them that they had not properly understood the science of prayer. They had not prayed enough. Their faith had grown weak because they had not stimulated it by prayer. They had been trusting in their commission, in the spiritual status Jesus had given them. And they had neglected to fulfill the conditions on which the efficacy and efficiency of their gifts depended. Had the disciples centered their thoughts upon the power of God within them, they would have been able to exorcise the unclean spirit. After the healing of this lunatic lad, Jesus and the 12 returned to Capernaum, and the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does not your teacher pay the temple tax?" Jesus was known to do things that were considered contrary to the law, but in this case, Jesus wished to pay the tax to avoid offense. Unfortunately, they had returned to Capernaum with an empty purse. So Jesus told Peter to cast a hook in the sea, and assured him that in the mouth of the first fish he caught, he would find 5 shillings with which to pay the tax for the 2 of them. The latest church commentary cannot accept this story. Other biblical commentators suggest that Peter may have caught a fish and sold it for 5 shillings, but such a story as this does not surprise spiritualists. My wife and I were staying at a vicarage some 10 miles from the sea. The weather had been bad, but at a last fine morning came and we decided to spend the day by the seashore. On reaching it, we took a couple of deck chairs and sat quite close to the sea. Later, I found to my dismay that I had left my purse at home and my wife had no money with her. We were very distressed because it was the first fine day of our very short summer holiday, and there seemed nothing for it but to return home. But while we were packing up our things, my wife's guide said to her, "Stay where you are. You need not go home." So we remained sitting close to the sea. Suddenly, a wave threw up at our feet a small object which looked like the flat heel of a slipper covered with shells and seaweed. On examining it, we found that it was an old purse with a strong clasp which kept it tightly closed. Inside was a shilling, a 6pence, and 5 coppers, which we bought food and drink, and we were able to remain at the sea all day. Cynics may laugh and ask 100 silly questions, but all that really matters is that the guide obviously knew that a wave would throw up a purse, the contents of which would solve our difficulty. And I can quite believe that Jesus had heard clairaudiently that if Peter would cast a hook in the sea, the temple tax could be paid. Waves do not regularly or constantly throw purses upon the beach. Neither do fishes regularly or constantly have 5 shillings in their mouths. But on one occasion, a wave did throw up a purse, and I see no reason for disbelieving that on another occasion a fish did have 5 shillings in its mouth. There is, of course, no proof whatever that Peter found money in a fish's mouth, but there is very real proof that a wave threw a purse at our feet. Such supernormal occurrences do regularly and constantly happen today in the lives of spiritualists who are in touch with the heavenly messengers whom God has ordained and appointed to succor and defend us. Were it not so, no intelligent person could believe the story of Peter, the fish, and the temple tax. End of chapter. All right, if you haven't done so, hit that like button. If you like what you see here and what you hear on this channel, go ahead and subscribe. Share it with your friends. Come back often. All right, let's head over to the next video as we continue the reading of The Psychic Life of Jesus.